Y'all, I once heard the coolest thing about baptism. It was the coolest because it summarized into just one sentence all the truth about baptism that we can declare with full confidence. So, are we ready? Here it comes. We believe that when a person gets baptized, something happens. That's it. That's the truth. Congrats. We are caught up to speed on this crucial baptismal theology. Something happens. Over the years, a whole lot of people have tried to say a whole lot more about what baptism is or does: forgive sins, initiate into a church community, mark us as Christ's own, etc., etc. But what often happens is that all of these extra descriptions forget about some of the valid baptisms that have happened. Consider, for example, all the people who were baptized just a few verses earlier in this chapter of Mark. This is long before the words Christian or church were in common vernacular. So any talk of this being a welcoming into a church community, that just wasn't present around that time. Going back even prior to that, the act that we now see as baptism's ancestor, it was a ritual water bath. That's what it was. It was over time that all of these different meanings and emphases got placed upon it. And when you look at the baptism of Jesus's time, skip ahead a bit to the book of Acts and the other disciples, and keep going all the way up to today, you will find an incredible diversity of ideas with regards to theological emphasis or thoughts about what baptism is or does. And there's a whole lot of them that we don't discount just because they're different, but they are different from what we declare about it today. And even when we do find one common thread that successfully ties together all these different expressions of the rite, we still, ironically, forget about Jesus. Jesus was baptized. We heard it a few moments ago in Mark's gospel. Now, Jesus was rather busy in this morning's reading. He went on to do some wilderness temptation resisting and some Galilean preaching. Basically, Mark doesn't let Jesus catch his breath much, if at all. But before all of that, Jesus was baptized. And a lot that we say about baptism just doesn't apply here. We say that baptism forgives sins. Well, was Jesus sinful? No, he wasn't. Did Jesus need godparents to help stay true to the course of God, or to become a member in good standing to vote in diocesan councils and other annual parish meetings? No, none of that's happening here. And yet here's Jesus getting baptized. Well, how about that? So this is something that's different from how we often think about baptism. This isn't a case where a person was, for example, marked as Christ's own forever. When we talk about stuff like that, we're really talking about baptisms besides Jesus's baptism. And that's okay. It's okay to realize that what happened to Jesus here just might be unique to Jesus. And that's all the more reason to ponder it. Because it's unique, all right. And sure enough, something happened. A few different somethings happened. For one thing, the heavens were torn open. We don't see that every day, do we? If we read throughout the whole Gospel of Mark, the phrase torn apart will come up just one other time. It's when Jesus is on the cross and breathes his last. You might recall that at that moment, the curtain of the temple gets torn in two. It's a sign, among other things, that there's now unfettered access capable into holy heavenly realities. A barrier is lifted. And the first mention in Mark's gospel of such barrier breaking is right here in Jesus's baptism. So yeah, when Jesus got baptized, something happened. If that wasn't enough, the Spirit descended like a dove. A dove was often a sign of peace, Consider, for example, the story of Noah, about which we heard an ending portion of it today, but right in the thick of things of that flood, you might recall that it was a dove that was sent out and brought back signs that the waters were receding. A dove brought hope after the waters. In the Gospel of Mark, the Spirit makes a grand entrance after Jesus' water submergence, and it appears in the form of peace. And to top this moment all off, we hear a voice came down from heaven saying, "You are my son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." A voice calling Jesus the Son of God, and nobody disputes it. In all of Mark's gospel, you will find that happen a grand total of 3 times. That's it. You've got right here, you have at the Transfiguration. Now, we heard Father Chuck mention that last week, but that's 8 chapters in the future from here. And the only other time is once again when Jesus is on the cross. A centurion declares it at that moment, right after Jesus breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple is torn in two. These are the moments where heavenly matters pierce into the temporal world. If one were to make a movie about the Gospel of Mark, those are the points where you might put in a lens flare or a full screen flash, one of those tools of visual storytelling where you show that the weight of the moment just can't quite be contained as is. Something is breaking in. And the first instance of this barrier breaking in all its facets is in Jesus's baptism. Phew, something has happened. Now, the Jordan River is still around today. You can visit it yourself when circumstances permit. I was part of a group that got to visit it a few years back, among other places in Israel and the greater area. We prayed, we renewed our own baptismal vows. Right as we did, I kid you not, a dove appeared next to us and landed on the dock. It was a beautiful, unplanned moment. And like many folks do, we collected some of the water that is there. So this is normally my church office, but here we have it, folks. This is some water from Jesus's baptism. And artwork of this moment in the gospel would lend you to think of it as being just clear, pristine waters from the River Jordan, but y'all, don't be fooled. It's filthy. It might have been cleaner back then, but it still was no guarantee that you could consider yourself clean if you had bathed in it. Now, this isn't a problem. It doesn't make a baptism any less baptism-ish, because baptism does something all right, but the main something it does isn't related to cleaning. This isn't your divine tide stain remover. Rather, when one gets baptized, among other things, one becomes aligned with worldly death. Think about it. You're getting submerged in water, or you got a few drops on your forehead, but that symbolized getting submerged in water. Is there an easier way to drown? This is one of the meanings that has been imbued into this rite over time. It aligns us, for example, with Noah and his family on that ark, who had torrential, killable waters surround them for days on end. Various folks point out further that this aligns us also with Moses and all those who passed through the Red Sea, protected from an overwhelming flood on either side by nothing short of dependence on God. That section of 1 Peter we heard today associates baptism with resurrection, and that's true, but in order to have a resurrection, there first has to be a death. That's the medium through which God does something in baptism. It might not be a literal death, it could be a death of other sorts. So with all that in mind, the appearance of a dove in Jesus's baptism, that might actually seem a little jarring, because for Jesus to come up from death-marking water, only for the Spirit to descend like a peace-marking dove, well, now we have peace in this world and death in this world paired together, and those are not common dance partners. What's going on here? Well, one facet of this is that the peace that God seeks to imbue in this world, as shown in Jesus's baptism and all other moments in Jesus's life, this is peace that is in this world, but it's not peace of this world. It's a peace coming from God. Consequently, it might not match with current worldly definitions. Now, Jesus certainly wasn't lacking in God's presence prior to baptism, but this divinely approved moment, it galvanized a truth that was present since the beginning and was ready to emerge further and further and further into the world, regardless if it conformed to worldly expectations. This difference of two different pieces, peace that the world defines and peace that God brings in, this has a ripple effect whenever Jesus calls someone to be his disciple. Pick any one of the disciples, look up the story. Jesus says, "Follow me," and that person gives up some aspect of their day-to-day life thus far. They leave it behind. They let it die. And it's here that we can find a connection between Jesus's baptism and our own. It draws us further and further along God's plan, which means further and further away from any other plan, from any other plans. Some of you might know a hymn in the 1982 hymnal. I'm talking about the one that starts with the line, "They cast their nets in Galilee." It talks about the disciples, calling them contented, peaceful fishermen. It's got a pleasant little tune that carries you through the hymn, but the words themselves in the 4 or 5 lyrics, they get less and less palatable as you progress through. We read about the peace of that time giving way to a peace of a different sort. There's the peace of God again. And we sing about young John who died homeless in Patmos. We sing about Peter who was crucified head down. This all musically culminates by calling the peace of God no peace but strife closed in the sod. Yet let us pray for one thing, the marvelous peace of God. Peace in this world, but peace that is not of this world. Apropos, baptism puts a person, or it beckons a person to become in sync with God and thus out of sync with the world. It's almost like a symphony where one horn player suddenly plays something different from the rest of the orchestra. It gets more and more obvious as the music goes on. Maybe some fellow musicians try to physically get his attention during measures of rest and say, "Dude, what are you doing? Can't you tell you're off?" But when all is said and done and everyone gathers backstage, it's discovered that that one horn player was sounded off because he was the only one playing the right piece. Everybody else was off track from the maestro. In this scenario, that one horn player created dissonance compared to their surroundings, sticking out like a sore thumb precisely because they were on the right track, regardless of how forceful others were in stopping him. That's one of the after effects of a God-imbued baptism. Something has laid claim to us which trumps any other possible allegiance. Going back to that section of 1 Peter we heard, a whole lot of it talked about baptism, but you might have noticed that it started off by capping a quick discourse on suffering. We heard the tail end of that thought today. And the suffering talked about here is not random chaotic tragedies. We don't mean a sudden car accident or plane crash or unwanted power outage. Rather, this is suffering that comes directly because of your faith. And for the original audience of 1 Peter, suffering could range from death, so martyrdom, to something less severe but still ostracizing. Being socially marginalized or getting quizzical looks from the neighbors due to this strange belief and your doggone adherence to this Jesus-inspired faith. Walking in a way that seems out of step, but not straying from the course. because we are pledged to a heavenly way, no matter how strange it seems to the world. Much like how Jesus played a tune and a key that the world wasn't always a fan of, but it was still worth playing. We are now part of the body of Christ, and this means we are accepting a role that has already confronted death and carries on through nothing less than dependence on God. No more space for egos or ungodly agendas. Instead, we're pointed to a greater purpose, one that breaks in from heaven, because something has happened. And while God isn't limited to working through people who have been baptized, we do see that God delights when people get baptized. Come on in, come die, come be grafted in to this resurrection work. Sometimes this will displease the world, much like it displeased those other musicians, or those who martyred John and Peter, or those who martyred Jesus, who crucified Jesus. But this doesn't mean we give up. So it's time to behold that something has happened, and something is going to keep happening. Over the next handful of Sundays in Lent, we're going to hear gospel stories that are of Jesus doing perplexing things. Now, this is true of virtually any gospel story already, really. Jesus is prone to do stuff that'll make us go, wait, what? But for this Lent in particular, we're going to hear Jesus do perplexing things in discomforting ways, ways that'll make us go, wait, what? Just next Sunday, Jesus is going to foretell about suffering on his part, including his death and resurrection. And when Peter tries to shush all this, Jesus is going to say, "Get behind me, Satan." A couple weeks after that, Jesus will be talking to a man named Nicodemus, and he'll talk about how light has entered into the world, but people of the world love darkness more than light. There's that dissonance again, being out of step with the world precisely because you're in step with God. These dissonances are going to reach a culmination on a cross where Jesus dies. But even there, it will be declared without denial by that centurion that truly this was God's son. So yeah, something has happened. It's time to see what this something is that's going to keep happening, and it's time to realize that some resistance or struggle just might be part of the calling. So settle in and get uncomfy. Amen.